In the vast expanse of the Orion Arm, humanity had always been considered the underdogs of the galaxy. The other species looked down on us, not for our technology or our achievements, but for what they perceived as our greatest weakness, our tendency to run from danger. They called us cowards, the ones who'd rather hide than fight. If only they knew how wrong they were. I remember the day everything changed, sitting in that cramped observation deck of the Galactic Council Station. As Earth's junior diplomatic aide, I spent most of my time fetching coffee and taking notes while the real diplomats handled the important stuff. The massive view screen showed the approaching swarm, a hostile race of crystalline beings that had already devoured 3 solar systems. Their ships looked like shards of obsidian, beautiful and deadly. The council chamber erupted into chaos. Representatives from 30 different species argued about military strategies, evacuation protocols, and defensive formations. The Centauri, with their advanced battle cruisers, promised to hold the line. The Moraks boasted about their superior tactical eye. Even the Vextol, ancient as the stars themselves, offered their reality-bending technology. But I noticed something that day. While they talked about glory and honor, while they made grand speeches about standing their ground, their hands trembled, their voices cracked. Deep down, they were terrified, frozen by the very instinct they mocked humans for possessing. That's when the emergency broadcast cut through all frequencies. A colony of 3 million souls, mostly families of maintenance workers who kept the hyperspace beacons running, lay directly in the swarm's path. The mighty warriors of the council fell silent. The strategic geniuses stared at their feet. The ancient races suddenly remembered urgent matters elsewhere. And then, breaking through the suffocating silence, a single human voice spoke up. "This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Earth merchant vessel Running Start. We're diverting course to assist with evacuation." More human voices followed. Cargo ships, mining vessels, even tourist shuttles. Every human ship within range responded. The council members watched in disbelief as these unarmed civilian vessels, these cowards, plotted an intercept course with certain death. I'll never forget what my supervisor whispered then. "You see, the thing about humans is, we don't run because we're afraid. We run because we're really good at it, and sometimes running toward danger is exactly what's needed." What followed would rewrite galactic history, but not in the way anyone expected. It wasn't about superior firepower or advanced technology. It was about something far more powerful, the courage to be scared and act anyway. The courage to look at impossible odds and say, well, someone's got to do it. As I watch the recordings now, years later, I can't help but smile at the irony. Dozens of human ships, famous for running away, burning hard toward the greatest threat our galaxy had ever faced. The very trait that made us the laughingstock of the cosmos would become our greatest strength. Because sometimes being brave isn't about not feeling fear. It's about knowing exactly what to do with it. But what happened next, in those crucial hours as our ramshackle fleet of merchant vessels faced down the crystalline death of the swarm, would change everything. None of us could have predicted how our so-called cowardice would transform into humanity's finest hour, or how the galaxy would never again question why humans always seemed ready to run, because they hadn't yet learned that there's a profound difference between running away and running toward. The question wasn't whether we would survive. The question was, what would the galaxy look like when they finally understood what human courage really meant? The Running Start wasn't built for this. I could hear her hull groaning under the strain as we pushed the engines beyond their safety limits. Around us, other human ships formed a loose formation, a ragtag fleet of cargo haulers, passenger liners, and mining vessels. None of us were warriors, but we all knew what needed to be done. From my position in the Council Station's observation deck, I watched the tactical displays with a mixture of horror and pride. The crystalline ships of the swarm filled the screens, their obsidian surfaces reflecting starlight like a sea of broken mirrors. They moved with an unnatural precision that made my skin crawl, their formations shifting and flowing like liquid darkness. Captain Chen's voice crackled through the emergency channel, steady despite the circumstances. "All ships, maintain course. Remember the plan. We're not here to fight. We're here to run interference. Buy those colonists time to evacuate. The calm in her voice helped settle the nervous energy crackling through the chamber. Even the council members had stopped their bickering to watch in stunned silence. That's when we saw something extraordinary. The civilian ships began executing maneuvers that made the military experts gasp. Cargo containers were strategically jettisoned, creating debris fields that forced the swarm to alter their course. Mining vessels used their industrial-grade tractor beams to redirect asteroids not as weapons, but as obstacles. Passenger ships designed for comfort rather than speed pushed their artificial gravity to the limit, using the generated force wells to disrupt the swarm's perfect formations. "We've been running our whole lives," one of the human captains transmitted, his voice strained but determined. "We know every trick in the book about how to slow down a pursuit. Now we're just doing it in reverse." The truth of those words hit home. Every evasive maneuver humans had perfected over centuries of being the galaxy's underdogs was now being used to protect others. The Council's tactical displays showed the evacuation progress at the colony. 20%, 30%. The swarm was being delayed, but they were adapting. Their crystalline ships began to change formation, breaking into smaller groups to navigate through our obstacles. They were learning, evolving their strategy in real time. "They're splitting up," Captain Chen announced. "Good. That means they're frustrated. Keep them that way. Every minute we buy is another 100 lives saved." The determination in her voice masked the cost of our intervention. Already, 2 human ships had been forced to abandon their positions, their engines pushed beyond recovery. But they had played their part. The Zentari representative, one of the proudest warrior races in the galaxy, approached me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Your people," he said quietly, "they know they cannot win this fight. It wasn't really a question." "Winning was never the point," I replied, watching as another cargo ship executed a desperate maneuver that scattered the swarm's forward elements. "We're not trying to defeat them. We're just trying to be the obstacle they can't ignore." As the evacuation percentage climbed past 50, the true cost of our intervention began to show. The swarm's weapons had finally found their mark, and the first human ship erupted in a silent flash of light. But even in death, we refused to yield. The dying ship's captain used her last moments to overload her engines, creating an electromagnetic pulse that disrupted the nearest swarm vessels. The question now wasn't whether we would survive. It was how many lives we could save before we couldn't run anymore. And as I watched both human courage and human ships burning bright against the darkness, I realized we were about to teach the galaxy a lesson about what real bravery looks like. The colony's evacuation had reached 70% when everything changed. The swarm, frustrated by our interference, began to show signs of a new strategy. Their crystalline ships started resonating at frequencies that made our sensors scream. They were no longer just trying to get past us. They were trying to break us. "All ships, adjust your shield harmonics." Captain Chen's voice carried a note of desperation I hadn't heard before. "They're trying to shatter our hulls with resonance waves." The human fleet, already stretched thin, began to adapt once again. Ships paired up, using their combined shield frequencies to deflect the worst of the assault. In the council chamber, the tactical displays told a story that made my heart sink. We had lost 8 ships now, their sacrifice marked by brief flares of light against the void. But each loss had meant something. Each had bought precious minutes for the colonists. The evacuation counter ticked up to 75%. The Vextal elder, who had been silent for hours, suddenly spoke. "Your people's actions defy logic," they said, their ancient eyes fixed on the battle. "You sacrifice yourselves not for victory, but merely to delay the inevitable." Their words carried no judgment, only a deep puzzlement that seemed to echo the sentiment of every alien species watching. "Sometimes," I replied, watching as another human ship deliberately positioned itself between the swarm and a colonist transport, "the most logical thing to do is to be completely illogical." The ship's hull was already showing signs of stress fractures, but it held its position. The next few minutes were pure chaos. The swarm had adapted to our debris fields and gravity wells, but they hadn't counted on human improvisation. Captain Chen's voice cut through the chaos. "All ships, initiate Protocol Firefleet." I watched in awe as the remaining human vessels began to execute a maneuver that could only have been born from desperation and genius. Our ships started releasing their emergency plasma vents in coordinated bursts, creating a web of superheated gas that played havoc with the swarm's crystalline structures. The enemy ships' perfect formations began to falter as they tried to navigate through the plasma field without their formations shattering from thermal stress. 85% evacuated, 90%. But the swarm was learning, adapting faster than we could create new tricks. They had already lost a quarter of their fleet to our desperate tactics, but they were still coming, and we were running out of ships, out of tricks, out of time. That's when Captain Chen made the call that would either save us all or doom us completely. All remaining ships, form up on my position. Divert all power to forward shields. Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. We're going to show them why humans are the best at running, right through their blockade. The council chamber erupted in shocked whispers as the surviving human ships began to form a tight arrow formation. The swarm, perhaps sensing our desperation, began to concentrate their forces. Their crystalline ships formed a wall of obsidian death directly in our path. 95% evacuated, just a few hundred more souls to save. But between us and them stood the full might of the swarm, their ships gleaming with malevolent purpose. And Captain Chen was proposing something that even the most hardened warrior races thought was insane. As I watched the human ships align for what could only be described as a suicide run, I finally understood what true courage looked like. It wasn't about being fearless. It wasn't about being the strongest or the most advanced. It was about looking into the face of certain death and saying, "Not today. Not while I can still run toward those who need me." What happened next would either become legend or remain forever untold in the vast silence of space. The moment before Captain Chen's fleet launched their desperate charge, something impossible happened. The swarm's crystalline ships suddenly began to emit a strange, pulsing light. Their perfect formations wavered, as if they were responding to some unseen signal. For a heartbeat, everything seemed frozen in time. And then we heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been possible in the vacuum of space, yet somehow transmitted through every communication channel simultaneously, a harmonic resonance that made the council chamber's windows vibrate. The swarm wasn't just attacking anymore. They were trying to communicate. There, singing, Captain Chen's voice was barely a whisper over the calm. The crystalline ship's resonance patterns shifted, creating complex overlapping frequencies that our sensors struggled to process. What we had interpreted as weapons fire was actually an attempt at communication, but of a kind so alien, so fundamentally different from anything we'd encountered, that we'd mistaken it for aggression. The council representatives watched in stunned silence as new data flooded their screens. The swarm wasn't destroying systems. They were trying to transform them, to reshape reality in a way their crystalline consciousness could understand. And our desperate, chaotic defense had accidentally created the exact resonance patterns they needed to make themselves understood. All ships, maintain formation but hold position. Chen ordered, her voice steady despite the revelation. Something's happening here that we don't understand yet. The surviving human vessels hung in space, their impromptu plasma field creating an unintentional symphony with the swarm's harmonics. The Vextile elder stepped forward, their ancient eyes wide with recognition. The patterns, they whispered, they match the primordial psalms of creation. Your species, in trying to save others, has accidentally recreated the fundamental frequencies of consciousness itself. But we had no time to process this revelation. The colony's evacuation had stalled at 98%, with the remaining civilians trapped in a section of the station where the artificial gravity had failed. And now the swarm was moving again, not toward us, but around us, their ships forming complex geometric patterns that pulsed with increasingly intense light. Whatever they're trying to tell us, Captain Chen's voice carried across all frequencies. We need to figure it out fast. Those colonists won't survive much longer without power. The tension in the council chamber was palpable as we watched both fleets hanging in space, human ingenuity locked in a deadly dance with crystalline intelligence. That's when one of the junior science officers noticed something on his readings. The resonance patterns weren't random. They matched the frequency of human brainwaves during moments of extreme stress. The swarm wasn't just trying to communicate. They were trying to understand why we would risk everything to save strangers. As this realization spread through the fleet, the swarm's formations began to shift again. Their ships moved with new purpose, creating patterns that seemed to mirror our own desperate tactics from earlier. They were learning, adapting not to destroy, but to comprehend. They're copying us, I breathed, watching the tactical displays. Everything we did to slow them down, they're repeating it back to us, but with their own twist. The crystalline ships were using their resonance fields to create safe corridors through space, paths that could protect the remaining colonists from the vacuum of space. But there was a catch. To use these corridors, someone would have to trust that these beings, who we'd been fighting just moments ago, were actually trying to help. Someone would have to run toward danger one more time, not away from it. And as I looked at the tactical display, showing both our battered fleet and the crystalline array of swarm ships, I realized we were about to redefine courage yet again. The question wasn't whether humans would take that risk. It was what would happen when we did. Because sometimes the bravest thing isn't charging into battle or standing your ground. Sometimes it's trusting that what looks like your enemy might just be trying to learn how to be your friend. Captain Chen's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Running start to all ships. I'm taking us in. Her ship, already battered from the earlier confrontation, began moving toward the crystalline corridor. The council chamber fell into a hushed silence, every species holding their breath as they watched what could either be humanity's finest moment or its last mistake. The running start entered the corridor of resonating energy, its hull illuminated by the pulsing lights of the swarm ships. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the ship's sensors began reporting something extraordinary. The crystalline resonance wasn't just creating a safe passage, it was repairing the damage to the ship's hull. All ships, follow my lead, Chen commanded, her voice filled with wonder. They're not just showing us the way, they're trying to help us. One by one, the remaining human vessels entered the corridor, their battered hulls beginning to heal under the swarm's harmonic influence. But the real test came when they reached the stranded colonists. The section of the station where they were trapped was now completely exposed to space, held together by emergency force fields that were rapidly failing. The swarm's ships moved into a new formation, creating a crystalline bridge between the station and the evacuation vessels. I don't believe it, one of the council members whispered. They're using their own bodies as an emergency evacuation route. The crystalline ships had physically linked together, their resonance fields combining to create a pressurized pathway through which the colonists could safely travel. As the last of the colonists made their way across this impossible bridge, something even more remarkable happened. The swarm's harmonic patterns changed again, and suddenly every communication device in the council chamber began translating their crystalline language. We have watched. The translation read, as you chose to risk yourselves for others. We have learned that what we thought was cowardice was actually the highest form of courage. You run not from danger, but toward those who need you. This is a concept we had not understood until now. The council chamber erupted in amazed murmurs as the swarm continued their message. They explained that they had been traveling through the galaxy, seeking species who could teach them about consciousness and connection. Their destructive appearance had been unintentional, a side effect of their attempt to understand organic life. But just as this revelation seemed to bring the crisis to a close, the swarm's message took an urgent turn. We are not the only ones searching. Their transmission continued. Others come, others who do not wish to learn, only to consume. We offer an alliance, for we have seen that your kind possesses something unique, the courage to run toward danger, even when all hope seems lost. Captain Chen's response was immediate and typically human. Well, she said, her voice carrying a hint of a smile, I suppose we'll have to teach them about running too. The remaining human ships formed up alongside their former enemies, no longer in opposition but in solidarity. As I watched this impossible alliance take shape, I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. The galaxy had mocked us for running, never understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is run, not away from danger, but toward those who need you most. And now, as humanity stood ready to face this new threat alongside the crystalline consciousness of the swarm, we had proven that courage comes in many forms. The council chambers buzzed with activity as representatives rushed to formalize this unprecedented alliance. But as I watched Captain Chen's ship dock with the station for repairs, I knew this wasn't just a story about survival or even about courage. It was about understanding that sometimes the thing you fear most might turn out to be exactly what you need, if you're brave enough to stop running away and start running toward it instead. The galaxy would never look at humans the same way again. And honestly, after everything we've been through, that was probably for the best. In the days that followed, the galaxy witnessed something remarkable. The swarm's crystalline ships and human vessels worked together, their combined strengths creating something entirely new. Our adaptability and their ancient knowledge merged into a partnership that left even the Vextol speechless. The Council, after centuries of viewing humans as the galaxy's eternal runners, had to revise every protocol and assessment they had ever made about our species. It turned out that our greatest perceived weakness, our instinct to run, had actually been our greatest strength all along. We just needed the right moment to prove it. Captain Chen became something of a legend, though she brushed off any attempts at formal recognition. "I just did what any of us would have done," she'd say, usually while reviewing plans for integrating swarm harmonics into human shield technology. The running start, now partially crystalline after its exposure to the swarm's regenerative frequencies, became a symbol of this new alliance. The colony we saved thrived, becoming the first of many joint human swarm settlements. The crystalline beings taught us about the fundamental harmonies of space itself, while we taught them about the infinite varieties of courage that organic life could display. Together, we began preparing for the threat they'd warned us about, but now we faced it with something neither of us had possessed alone: hope. I remember standing in that same observation deck weeks later, watching human children playing near the crystalline formations that had sprouted in the station's recreational areas. The swarm's presence had changed us, just as we had changed them. They learned to communicate through more than just harmonics, and we learned to hear the music in the spaces between stars. The Zentari representative who had questioned our tactics during the crisis approached me one day. "We had it all wrong," he admitted, watching a group of human engineers working alongside swarm entities to upgrade the station's defenses. "We thought courage meant never running, never retreating, but your people understood something we didn't. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is run toward uncertainty." As for me, I got promoted from junior diplomatic aide to chief liaison for human swarm relations. Turns out, being present for first contact with a crystalline consciousness looks pretty good on your resume. But more than that, I got to witness firsthand how the galaxy's understanding of courage evolved. The unknown threat the swarm warned us about still loomed somewhere in the darkness between stars. But we're ready for it now, in a way we never could have been before. Human ships and crystalline vessels patrol together, their crews learning from each other, preparing for whatever comes next. And that's really what this story is about, not just about how humanity proved itself to the galaxy, or how we turned enemies into allies. It's about understanding that true courage wears many faces. Sometimes it looks like standing your ground, sometimes it looks like charging into battle. And sometimes, just sometimes, it looks like running as fast as you can toward the thing that scares you most. The Council keeps the recordings of that day as a reminder, not of human bravery or swarm wisdom, but of how the galaxy's greatest misunderstanding led to its greatest alliance. Because in the end, we didn't just save a colony or make first contact with an alien consciousness. We proved that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about what you do with that fear. As I write this from my new office, overlooking the crystalline spires that now adorn the station, I can't help but smile. The galaxy called us cowards because we ran. Now they call us heroes because we never stopped running. We just learned to run in the right direction.